Okay, let me try and explain to you what I think what the aquifer structure is. Just to our right, we've got the part of the upland swamps. Now that's a mass of sediment in a shallow basin on the plateau surface, and that's held up by a continuous sandstone base. And one of the issues in coal mining in this area is if that sandstone base is broken, then the swamp drains and becomes dry. Within the sandstone underneath those sediments, which is a thickness of Hawkesbury sandstone, there is some fresh water, but over this part of the catchment the yield from that is fairly small. So most of the water that goes to catchment, be it Warrenora or Cataract here, then most of that in fact goes from surface flow and from slow drainage out of the swamp sediments. Underneath that you've got what is widely recognised as a almost impermeable layer, what they call an aquiclude, the Bald Hill claystone, and that's seen by most of the companies around here as a barrier to water moving from the surface down into the lower sediments, lower sedimentary rocks. Underneath that you have some more sandstones and shales and then the coal seams. Now we know that those other sandstones and shales have water associated with them because that water flows into the coal seams when the coal's mined. And that's why the water which currently holds the gas in the old gophs, that's where the water comes from. Not from the surface, not from the Hawkesbury sandstone, but from the lower shales and sandstones and from the coal seam itself.
Okay. So what would be the consequences of penetrating that aquiclude that you referred to?
In coal seam gas mining, what you do is you put a well down which should seal that passage from the surface to the coal seam. So you shouldn't get direct leakage from the surface down. But the water that comes into the old gophs or into your coal seam gas fracked area has to come from somewhere. So it's either coming, and if you get a certain amount, an appreciable amount of subsidence, I think there's some growing evidence that there is connectivity established between those lower aquifers and the surface aquifer in the sandstone, not so much in the swamps, but in the sandstone.
And that's even if it's a good quality well with good casings, there's good quality control of the mining process, the drilling process itself, you'll still have that as a risk? Or does the risk really arise when...
The risk is a consequence of the subsidence rather than the well. But of course, if you're pulling the water that's already in, let's say, an old goph, if you pull that out, more water has to come from somewhere. That's then going to, again, possibly create connectivity that has not been there before. And one of the things that we know about the aquifers in this area, is we know very little about the aquifers in this area. It's possible that the mining companies, with the data that they have from inflows to their mines, have more data than we know. But in terms of published, scientifically reputable material, we know very little about this.
You can say it.
Very little.
So if there is a change then in the water flow connectivity has changed, that has impacts both with respect to the local surface ecology and habitats, but then would also have an impact downstream with respect to catchment areas? So
yeah.
Water flowing into the dam?
I mean, in reality, these are going to be fairly small issues in terms of surface delivery of water, I think. The biggest issues in my mind of this sort of thing is the clearing, the infrastructure, and the effects of those on these areas which we've been fighting hard to keep as integral water catchment. The integrity of this water catchment has been so much under threat from surface extraction of clays and so forth, from the impacts of underground coal mining, from, in previous years, some loony ideas of putting industrial areas up here. You may or may not be aware that in the early 1980s it was conservation groups who fought public access into these things because we realised the impacts that it could have of just large numbers of people coming through. But in a water poor continent, why would you challenge the integrity of the best and most reliable rain-fed catchment near Australia's largest city?
the question. Yeah.
And that's my big issue with this operation. I mean, we're looking at an area from just the head of the swamp here back to the fire trail, and the Apex EA says, well, we're just near a fire trail which is already disturbed. But I can't see the vehicles 50 metres away.
Right.
So all of this would go, and the same distance either side of us. Then you have to dig a trench to bring your pipeline and your, presumably your power in, or at least dig some stanchion holes. That fire trail now is accessible to fire trucks and so forth, but it would have to be accessible as an all-weather road. So presumably that would be a hard stand paving of some sort, even if it was just compacted soil. All of this bush would be moved away, and the soil here is sterile from a very close to the surface. The active nutrient-rich layer of this soil is about that deep. And if you then pick up the soil from below and dump it on the side, I can show you sites in similar areas to this that haven't revegetated in 10 years because you're just pulling up quartz, clays, no organic matters, no seed store. And if you store the topsoil, it dries out, the seeds die, the organic matter decays, and you're really no better off. So there's a huge, if you're doing that every 600 metres, if you're clearing 50 metres every 600 metres, then this is going to look like a little chessboard.
Oh, like that classic photo from the air of the Chinchilla gas field in Queensland.
Exactly.
Quite
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, that's right.
And those clear ways that you'll need for pipelines could be perhaps 100 metres across. They might be larger than 50 metres if they want to have proper service access to the pipeline. So it's a significant impact on the bushland.
That's right. And the other thing is, of course, they're pulling up water for which they have to scrape out a holding pond, and apparently they will cover the top of it so it doesn't flow out when there's excessive rain. And this area can have very high rainfalls, but you've still got to get rid of that water, so that's got to go out by the road. You also have to find a place to dump that water, unless you re-inject it in one of the other wells, in which case you have to transport it to there.
There's a risk there, yeah.
So there's a whole lot of, that water is going to be possibly quite alkaline, certainly full of coal sediments, and quite possibly high in some significant heavy metals.
It'll be very saline too, I guess.
And very saline, yes. So it's not what you want near the surface of your catchment area.
So would you be satisfied with simply the announcement of the inquiry?
I've got two problems with that. I think an inquiry is a good thing, but I've got two problems. One is with exploration licences, in that those are granted without any community consultation or serious environmental assessment. And the reality is, once an exploration licence is granted, the company is anticipating that the mine will go ahead. There's no company that just does an exploration licence and hopes that something might happen in the future. This is a positive step in a project plan. So that first positive step for the company is taken without community consultation, without serious environmental assessment, and without any really significant assessment of what the scale of the total project will be and the impacts on the environment. So that's my first one. The second one is that we know from our experience with coal mining that the community is always playing catch up. Even when a mine plan is proposed, the mine, once it is established, the environmental results of monitoring are assessed, but by the time you notice that there's damage or can prove that there's damage, then a whole lot of work has happened, and really their plans are 2 years ahead of where they are now. So if something happens here, then they will argue that their mines are set in concrete for the next 2 years. So you've got at least 2 years of damage before any action is taken. And we are always playing catch up because of this delay between when monitoring is done and when that shows up a damage, and then when adaptive management occurs.
Yeah.
And we have to reduce that time span between recognition of damage and adaptive management of the mine. The other part about it is that I think over the last few years there's been a very significant change in community expectation about the management of these lands. And the removal of the Dharawal and associated swamp areas from the bull seam operation of Illawarra Coal, I think indicates both the government's recognition of the importance of these areas and also the community's expectation that they will be preserved. 5 years ago it was a very much more, it was a much less well-known issue. And I suppose when I did my PhD up here and I started in the early 1980s, I chose to work here because it was an environmentally non-controversial issue. And at that stage, the previous scientific paper on these swamps had been written in 1941. So these were just not in the frame of public concern. But the impacts of longwall mining on them, the issues such as Warattua rivulet, the questions of the value of the catchment versus the desalination plant, the whole impacts on the public psyche of the long drought that we've just been through, all of those have brought these up so that people who don't have access to here for good reason, for the preservation of these areas, but because they're out of sight, in a sense they're out of mind. Well, now I think they're in mind, and I think that's a wonderful outcome.
So you would support the idea of an exclusion zone? Do you think there needs
Absolutely.
to be an inquiry around the issue, or should it just be declared out?
I think it should just be, I just think it's a nonsense
I agree.
to have them in water catchment areas.
Seems to be a no-brainer. In fact, it's hard to reconcile the discrepancy between an individual being threatened with an $11,000 fine and a mining company being able to come in and clear land and dig for gas.
That's right. The top threats for coal seam gas, if coal seam gas mining went ahead in here, particularly a dense network of infrastructure which would seriously disturb the vegetation, the surface hydrology, and the soils and their capacity to, and the area's capacity to rehabilitate. That would be the most important one. Secondly, the unknown but potentially considerable impact of pulling water out of these gas, out of the coal seam areas, and the increased connectivity, the possibility of further subsidence. Those would be the two top issues in my view. It's actually very difficult to rehabilitate an area like this. You can make it revegetate, you can make a few things grow on it, but you cannot reconstruct this. Particularly in the swamps, you cannot reconstruct these things. You can go to even old seismic lines, which is much less disturbance in the catchment, that may be 5-10 years old, and you can still walk down them. You can still see them. You can see them on an aerial photograph, despite the fact that there has been rehabilitation work done.
Yeah,
So
the attempts to remediate the Warattua rivulet are another example of that. They've so far failed to glue back the damage arising from longwall mining.
Well, Warattua rivulet is just a total disaster. Total disaster. And the plugging of some holes with masses and masses of plastic.
Iodide or something, isn't it?
It's what's
Polyurethane resin.
Polyurethane resin, yeah. That's kept up water behind one small rock bar. But you've got a kilometre or more of stream which is still completely broken. And we know that that rock is broken to a minimum of 15 metres below the surface.
Deeper, yeah.
I'd like to see the water catchment seen as really high priority for our community and therefore worthy of a great deal of protection, and therefore I'd like to see any mining operation constrained so that it does not have a major impact on the surface of this plateau.